start, I just wanted to say I'm really happy to be here, and I want to congratulate Matt and VentureBeat because what they're doing is extremely important. The last year or two at USA Today, one of the things I was tasked with was going to places like Pittsburgh, Charleston, Phoenix, Burlington, Vermont, and finding out where some of the innovation is happening. It's not just happening in Silicon Valley. People are leaving, and for good reason. It's a tough place. It's a tougher place to live because of the infrastructures we can attest in terms of traffic, just getting around, the cost of living, et cetera. So this is a very vital conference, and in fact, actually, there's a possibility that we're not competing, mind you, but Barron's might be thinking about doing something similar to this in Detroit, kind of based on the local economy. So, yeah, so the more we can do, the better. Anyway, we're going to start with Ira. We're going to start with DBL. We're going to talk about the impact investing in this kind of dual mission of delivering top-tier venture capital returns while benefiting social, environmental, and economic benefits. And I guess in the case of your company, which is a leader in this area, you've proven that those two ideas and concepts are not mutually exclusive, but inherently connected. I'm wondering what's behind the philosophy and how you do it.
Well, thanks, John. I want to also start giving a few thanks as well. First of all, Matt and I did meet probably about 15 plus years ago, and he is someone who's always been ahead of the curve, as the governor likes to say, and it's been true in a number of different areas, and this is such an important thing you're doing here that I couldn't be more appreciative of having me here and having convening the group here. To you, to Lauren, Anna, and the entire Blueprint team, just a huge thanks, and hopefully the first of many. Thank you. I also will give a shout out to Robert Goldberg, who many of us have known for a lot of years and couldn't be a bigger champion of this region, and is bringing the kind of entrepreneurship that he's been part of for so long. So thanks, Robert, for all you're doing for this. And I do want to just really give a special thank you and appreciation to the governor. Having been on the board of Tesla for a decade, when he references the book that will one day get written, when it does, the governor's passion and leadership and vision relative to so many other governors who were competing for the Tesla Gigafactory is going to go down as one of the primary reasons that the Gigafactory is here. And he talks about the job not being done. I can tell you his continued commitment, not just for the Gigafactory, but for other projects like it, is something that is palpable and is something that really, to the point of blueprint, Matt, Governor, you are a blueprint for what other governors in other states ought to be doing, and we could not be more appreciative, so thank you. So, John, as you said, DBL does stand for double bottom line, and what we've been doing for a lot of years now is trying to debunk the old view that in order to derive top-tier financial returns, you had to give up on the social and economic development, environmental return. And our whole premise is that today we are at a unique point in time where those can and should go hand in hand, and rather than actually being zero-sum or trade-off, it is all about, if you back the kind of entrepreneurs that DBL is backing, how those can actually coexist and reinforce each other. And really at the root of this premise comes down to what is the lifeblood of any venture capitalist, and that's the entrepreneur. And we're seeing this unprecedented wave of entrepreneurship that does not believe in that old conventional view of trade-off. And what got the 19th century and 20th century wealth and paradigm of make money by day and think about your mission orientation at night, or make money in the first part of one's chapter of life and then use the back half to think about philanthropic and other efforts, is really now being challenged. And it's being challenged by some of the great entrepreneurs who want to make the next chapter of their personal and professional lives aligned, much like an Elon who did PayPal early and now has dedicated his entire life to the mission orientation that he has, but also the millennials who are not giving up or shedding an old philosophy, but today that is the ethos of how so many entrepreneurs think about it. And that's actually, I think in many ways, why this has become a competitive differentiator and not something that has anything to do with trade-off anymore. DBL actually got its roots in place-based investing, and the first fund was all about the blueprint notion of trying to invest in areas that have historically been underserved, finding areas that have been left behind, and bringing entrepreneurship as a way to catalyze economic development, job creation, and opportunity. And that first fund has permeated the way we think about so many aspects of the way we invest. We actually track what's known as LMI areas, lower moderate income areas, where we invest. We track diversity. I'm proud to say in an asset class that right now should not be very proud of its diversity efforts. In our fund right now, we are tracking not at the 2 to 4% venture average, but right now 57% of our companies are women-led. It is something that, again, to the point of investing in areas of the country, is actually about the opportunity. It is similar from a gender standpoint. We do not back entrepreneurs because they're women. We back great entrepreneurs who happen to be women. And similarly, when we invest in companies that are based in LMI areas or areas that are not necessarily on the coast or where a lot of the money in the asset class goes, we're finding great opportunities.
You know, I was going to go back to something you said just briefly. Was there an inflection point where doing both good and being profitable, was there a company that kind of led that way? Because we hear stories in Silicon Valley about Salesforce, perhaps or Google. Yeah. But was there somebody who predated that?
You know, again, I think a good venture capitalist actually follows the great entrepreneurs. And what has changed, as I mentioned, is really the change in entrepreneurs that walked in our door who were completely mission aligned and wanted partners who didn't necessarily view the world in a trade-off paradigm, but actually could help them, be on their boards, invest with them, become partners with them, to find ways to realize this notion of integration.
Okay. So speaking of great entrepreneurs, let's shift to Tesla. So you've been there since the early days as an investor and a board member. It's now has a market cap of more than $50 billion. Can you tell us about its journey, since it wasn't always obvious it was going to become this enormous success?
You know, it really is a great example of, I think, again, what Matt described as as the problem of backing mercenary and not backing missionary. From the early days of Tesla, it has been a long journey, and those early days were incredibly challenged. We were staring the dark abyss of having a negative gross margin product, supply chain that was challenged, and needing a cash at various points in time. And I give complete credit to the team that had the tenacity and perseverance. And it is because of this mission-driven approach that they had relative to some of the competitors. There were other competitors in the space, and the mercenaries actually took that off-ramp when the going got tough. And part of being a mission-driven entrepreneur is navigating your way through the inevitable speed bumps, and Tesla sure had them. When we invested, I love the slide which talked about the skepticism of Silicon Valley that Matt put up. And it really, I think, defines so many of the great opportunities historically in entrepreneurship where the early days are met with radical skepticism. And that was true in Tesla's case. The notion of trying to overhaul the 100-year internal combustion engine against the backdrop of failed electric car startups, and frankly, just car startups, was met with tremendous resistance and naysayers. And it was, I think, the naysayers in many ways that gave the conviction to the team to double down those efforts the way they did and to navigate through the tough times. And it is a great lesson to entrepreneurs, because every great company, no matter what great young company we've backed and has achieved any kind of success, there were similar kind of challenging times. And I think what differentiates those great companies, of course it's great technology, of course it's the great markets they're investing in, but what it really comes down to is the differentiated team and that tenacity to persevere during challenging times. We're now, as the governor referenced, we're sitting here with not just a market cap of 50 billion plus, but we think we're in the first inning of the chapter, and we have a lot ahead with the integration with our energy business, with the expansion efforts beyond just Fremont, now to here and to places like Buffalo and around the globe. So we're very excited.
When you talk about perseverance, you mentioned Fremont, and the investment in Fremont is a classic example of economic revitalization, because that was a success sprouting from a failure from the previous operation. What happened there, and how does it inform your decision to invest in Reno/Sparks?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, for anyone who doesn't know the longer version of the story, Fremont was the site of the largest auto manufacturing facility west of the Mississippi. And about 10 years ago now, it got closed. It was a GM facility, and we ended up being in an area where there was massive devastation from a job loss perspective. And it wasn't just at the time the 4,500 employees that lost their job, but the multiplier effect, which is something profound and palpable if you've actually invested in these regions. You had about an 8 to 9 to 1 ratio in the region of additional job loss. And so the Fremont and South Bay area was something that just in a very short period of time had massive suffering. And it was very sad to see. I remember the day that we as a board approved the Fremont purchase, and we walked into that building, and that became the early days of what has now become the largest employer of manufacturing jobs in California. And the Fremont area has just had massive revitalization. We now have more direct employees in that facility than NUMMI had at its peak. And of course, the multiplier effect has taken shape. And there's a number of other companies that have now become a magnet for other companies to also be in that area. And so seeing the radical metamorphosis of an area that was thriving and then suffering and now achieving probably as big a success as the region has ever had is the blueprint to doing a number of other efforts like what's being done here.
I'm from San Jose, so I remember that in Fremont, what happened, and it sounded like the same old kind of narrative. It was about the dying auto industry. Sure, yeah. It was like a hopeless situation. So it was kind of a phoenix in what you pulled off there. I'm going to be precise in this next question because it's pretty touchy. But public-private partnerships have a checkered history. They often are challenging and misaligned in terms of interests. On the other hand, the partnership between Nevada and Tesla has been heralded as the epitome of a win-win situation that matched the state's goals with your company's mission, meaning Tesla. How is that achieved, and why is this important, and how can it be emulated by other states moving forward, particularly some states that are here?
Well, I think the governor did a good job setting the backdrop of just how large and massive an effort this is. This has been, at various points, the largest construction project on planet Earth. It will be the largest building. For anyone who took the tour yesterday, I'm just curious how many actually got to see it. I'm so pleased that you got to see this. Every time I go back to the factory, it's stunning how big it is, and it's stunning what a small percentage relative to completion it is. Both those actually strike me every time I go back. But it has actually created an enormous number of jobs. We've seen, and the governor did a good job explaining the revitalization of this area. And I think Tesla's been a very important part of that. But you just see a massive set of job creation. There's partnerships with the local schools around training and development. I think the community here has really embraced the company, and in turn, I think the company has done a great job developing these public-private partnerships. It's actually one of the hallmarks of DBL is working in public-private partnerships is a very important part of the blueprint. It's a very important part of how you actually can develop the kind of loyalty and community and win-win in these areas. So as the governor referenced, the negotiation for getting the factory was something that Nevada was in competition with a number of states. I think he talked a little bit about a number of the key tenets that helped Nevada win. Number one, I think there was radical alignment around the idea of mutual prosperity. And this, at the time that this was being negotiated, there were other big manufacturing opportunities that other companies were competing to go into states, and the states that actually were competing for those opportunities did it in the form of grants. And that's actually been one of, I think, the key problems historically with some of these public-private partnerships is huge incentives to convince a company to come in, and it's not been without the belts and suspenders of potential not living up to the bargain side of the equation.
Before you go on, it's interesting, your timing is interesting because I believe Amazon did their second, and you don't have to comment on this, but they did their second wave of interviews with prospective cities and towns, And I think they went to Montgomery County in Maryland, which is offering something like $7 billion in tax incentives.
Right.
So we see that being played out. We also see the Apple second headquarters, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
So there's this whole kind of long kind of dance in
You're
negotiation.
right. No, you're 100% right, and it's exactly how a lot of areas have competed to bring in the jobs. But what was done here, and again, I give credit to the governor and the economic development team, is for the folks in Nevada, they actually created a win-win. It's often described as a can't lose, and that is the economic incentives that were provided were only done at the point where Tesla had done a certain amount of investment. It was not given upfront. It was given as a function of what Tesla actually accomplished. And it was a function of rewarding the company for performance, not just for promises. And that's the radical difference I think the state did. And in turn, the company has lived up to its promises. It's gotten a tremendous amount of investment in the state. I think we're up to a little north of $3 billion right now. We've got thousands of jobs that have been, that were initially described or actually been realized. The incentives are at a very small fraction of what's been invested in the state. I think it's, if the company realizes its entire objectives, there'll be about $1 billion of incentives, but only if it creates $100 billion of economic prosperity to the state. And that $100 billion was an independent assessment, nothing to do with Tesla's forecast. Those were independent assessments of, that dictated how that framework ultimately unfolded. I think it is a good blueprint for how other states ought to attract companies like Tesla, because in the end, if the company doesn't perform, then the states are not out that money. And particularly in the heartland where budgets have been challenged in many states, having that radical alignment is incredibly important.
We have time for probably one more question, and that was, I'm not sure if you talked about this publicly, but before choosing this area, how long was the process in deciding, and how many different cities or states did you look at? Without, you provide examples.
It was a very competitive process, as you'd expect. I think, again, Nevada deserves a lot of credit. For a number of things I mentioned, I'll cite one more, and that is the need for speed. One of the key criterion that Tesla had was just how quickly we wanted to deploy this capital and how quickly we wanted to create the Gigafactory. And there were a number of states that did have the red tape that the governor was referring to. And again, against the backdrop of his and his team's leadership, the notion of trying to find ways to meet the time incentives of entrepreneurship, to meet the time incentives of the kind of entrepreneurship that Tesla and many others represent, was probably as important as any of the factors in driving the decision.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to ask you one more question. Just in terms of this type of a show, this is not your typical tech show. Most of your tech shows are not in a setting like this. They're not as narrow in focus, or they're unwieldy, and sometimes there's just there's a lot of noise and a lot of lost messaging.
Yeah.
Do you foresee more of these types of events involving Heartland, where we move away from the coasts and more inland?
Yeah, this is an amazing event, but I think it's reflective of the underlying important trend, and that is entrepreneurship expanding beyond the coast and expanding beyond, as important as beyond the coast, it's expanding into industries and areas that have been underserved by the venture community historically. If you looked back at the sectors that have garnered venture dollars, it was a highly concentrated set of sectors that captured the lion's share of venture dollars. And what we're beginning to see, and it's clearly a focus of DBL, is investing in areas where you've had iconic names, often oligopolies, and absolutely described as underserved by innovation and entrepreneurship. And as you expand into the heartland, industries that haven't had the kind of venture dollars and entrepreneurships targeting it become industries that end up being great for opportunity.
What are a couple of the industries?
For us, we're focusing a lot on food and ag. We've got an incredible company called Farmers Business Network that is trying to empower the small farmer across the heartland and enabling the kinds of tools and technology for decision making that the small farmer really hasn't had with oligopolies on both sides of the supply and demand side. We're seeing a number of other types of manufacturing intensive industries like space is another good example. The kind of industrial innovation that defines many places the heartland is key. And of course, what we're as well known for as any is investing in the energy ecosystem. And the energy industry is obviously not just the coast. If one's going to be an effective energy investor, one has to look across the country, across the heartland. And the good news is, it ends up being great opportunities for those who are willing to do more than just drive a few stops along the Silicon Valley freeways, and in fact, find the great entrepreneurs of the country that are in these great areas of potential innovation.
Well, thanks so much for your insights. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, John.
To all of you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Nice job.
That was good. Thanks.
Yeah.